What's up, y'all? I want to talk today about a question I got on yesterday's stream. So yesterday, somebody asked, what do I think the future of CMS is? Or call it CMS plus sort of like no and low code and code generation. Basically, a code generation, anything where you basically have a non-developer, somebody who's not an engineer, not technical, quote unquote. So you have a non-eng doing some form of what would traditionally be seen as eng work, right? So this could be a whole bunch of flavors of different stuff. This could be, we can look at those examples, right? So this could be CMS, right? Old school. This is maybe the oldest school category here. If you think of the original web, where we would write code and then we would just push it up to servers. That's what you did, right? You want to update the website, you write code, and you push it to the server. Nothing super crazy or shocking about that, except when you realize, like, if you just want to get a blog post live, then you're going to write that blog post as, post.html, whatever it is. If you look at like Paul Graham's website, I'm pretty sure this is how it's done, because each page I feel like is just sa1.html at the root directory. But yeah, I mean, you would just FTP a new file up. Great, it's updated. We got to Web 2.0 and started saying, oh, well, that's kind of a pain. What if we wanted a blog to be contributed by people who are not developers? And we invented this concept as a CMS. It's like the first time ever we could have some flavor of code be updated by someone who's not a coder. Now, fast forward a little further, we've got other options. We've got sort of like no code. Kind of hate this term, but it is what it is. No code is like your drag and drop GUI. You've got Webflow or whatever, and you've got this drag and drop interface. And now anybody who's not a developer can go and just drag and drop, maybe collaborate in real time, kind of Figma style. And that's a thing. And that has its own interesting pros and cons. And there's worlds where people want to use that for various use cases, and there's worlds where people don't want to use that for various use cases. And then, fast forward even further, we've got AI coding, right? So you've got the ability for AI to generate code for you. That's where we could do maybe a landscape in a moment, but that's where you've got products like Bolts, Bolts.new, and Lovable. And now a person can just make an app. There was a period of time where people were using things like Cursor for this, and Cursor could do just type in the composer and it could generate things. But for Cursor, you have to have things like a local environment. That sucks. Local env. Sucks if you're not a developer, because how do we set that up? I've seen people struggle with that. You have to set up a repository or just a local folder or whatever. You need to know some basics of coding. You need to figure out how to deploy it yourself. But then comes basically Bolts and Lovable, who give you that sort of Claude Sonnet multi-file editing right in the browser. You just go to a box. Let's just go to one of them. Let's just go over to bolts.new. Just go to a box and say, make me an app, whatever it is, right? Make me a CRM dashboard app. And then it'll just start generating the app for you. Lovable uses React, Tailwind. Bolt uses whatever the heck you want. You want it to be built with Svelte and whatever the hell. Awesome. Bolt's going to do that for you. Let me move this out of the way. And if I zoom out a little bit, you can see, great. It's generating the application for me right here. I can keep chatting with it and keep updating it. The cool thing is people sort of realized, this was a bit of a breakthrough, is that, in short, Claude 3.5 Sonnet fucking rules at coding, at accurate coding. It could generate a UI for you, and this is like not shocking, right? Like you could go to Claude.ai and just tell it, like, make me a React component for a CRM dashboard. And it's actually going to do a good job. Now, the thing is, Claude, at least historically, didn't visualize it. They did add artifacts, which sort of visualize it. That's what V0 did back in the day. They said, oh, ChatGPT and Claude can generate UIs, but you don't realize how useful those UIs are or how good they are if you can't preview it. So original version of V0 was just literally like take what the LLMs like GPT-4o or Claude could output and visualize it. It was really funny. Now, that's not how they marketed it. They marketed at the original marketing of E0, by the way, was fucking, we trained our own model that is, what is it? Oh, God, uh, what is chat? Help me out here. What is the really, really good image service that generates images and you do it all in Discord? Midjourney. They said we trained Midjourney for React. You fucking didn't. You took GPT 4.0 and you took a prompt and you got back code and you visualize that code. So you have a React app that can just generate view that code. Now it's cool because you can see, like, I can go into Claude and now Claude can visualize it too. And now you see the visual, and Claude's so good. Like, this UI is freaking great, and I can change it any way I want. Good defaults, modify, etc. V0 is expanded. They do more now. They do kind of, when Claude Artifacts came out, they did Claude Artifacts too. Basically, very closely fast following. And then now I think they're trying to do what Bolt does, right? So they've been very much just like visualize ChatGPT, now do Cloud Artifacts, now do what Bolt does. What they do that's nice is they do some prompting to suggest like use ShadCN styling. So VZO is great if you want ShadCN styling. I think not the go-to if that's not what you want. If you work on a real company or whatever, it's, somebody's asking, is this real? Anyway, I'll finish that thought. If you work at a real company, ShadCN styling is not probably what your company looks like or what you want. And there's a lot of nuance there, but Bolt and Cursor can work with sort of like any kind of coding style, any coding framework, etc. So that's pretty cool. I don't know why Kate Gray's asking, is this real? Like, is this real life? Do you mean like what is it, Donnie goes to the dentist or something? This is real. Maybe you have to turn on Cloud Artifacts. But anyway, let me go over to Bolts. And Bolts failed. Let's see if we can fix the problem. But Bolt, I had to generate my CRM dashboard, and it's generating the code, and it'll visualize the UI too. So we'll see the UI here. Super cool. I can hit a button to connect to Supabase for a database. There we go. Here's my dashboard. And the dashboard might work. Like, I can just tell it, right? Make it so when I navigate to the other pages in the sidebar, those pages exist. This might take some time because it's going to generate the whole pages, but this is all these products are. Let's list them out. Let's create the definitive list here. Let's go a little smaller fonts. So whether it's Cursor, the first big one, and Cursor's really good for like if you are a developer already and you're editing code, but people started using this as like, I'm not an engineer and coding. There was that video that went viral of this like 5-year-old girl coding some stuff. And believe me, for every case that goes viral of somebody having amazing success, there's 99,000 cases of people who are having a terrible time. People who just like, oh, I heard Cursor could build me app. Build me a Facebook clone that has facial recognition AI, blah, 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 and it doesn't do it. And it's like, hey, some people need to be giving better guardrails around like what is the AI probably going to do well versus not. But whether it's Cursor or Bolt, if you don't know Lovable is a very, very good tool. It's like it's very similar to Bolt. It's React, Tailwind, ShadCN specific, so kind of like V0 in that regard, but probably the highest quality at just build me an app and at building you an app effectively, debugging, etc. Most people who have used both of these, especially if you're not a developer, tend to like Lovable. A developer will probably prefer Bolt because it's a great boilerplate generator. I'll get back to like where these things are useful, but Bolt is a great boilerplate generator. You use Svelte and whatever tech stack, and you just want, a basic shell of an app with some basic functionality, and you're going to download that and continue with that. I think Bolt is the best for that. If you're just like, hey, I'm not a developer and I just want to make a basic app, and I'll get back to like, there's a lot of failure paths here, but like, it's also incredible. Like really, for those who don't know, I started my career as a designer. I taught myself to code because I needed coding skills to build products. And I struggled to work with developers in a way where we could get like all the details exactly what my sort of OCD-ness was looking for. And so I was like, hey, I'll just figure it out myself. That took a lot of work. If Lovable or Bolt existed back then, I would have gone crazy on those. I mean, these, and again, these are just the Claude wrappers. These are all just Claude. There's the meme with the Scooby-Doo and you take the mask off and it's all Claude. So also whether you're doing Windsurf or even now GitHub Copilot is using it. Claude is the best code generation, code editing model that's ever existed by far. I don't give a shit about GPT-01 or even O3. These things are crazy slow, crazy expensive, and not as good. And any of my testing, not as good as coding. Claude is the best at coding. Its code is accurate. Its quality is decent. When it updates code, it doesn't break the code. And it's fast and it's cheap, especially for what it is, especially compared to these two. These things are horribly slow. They do great in benchmarks, and they're actually so unusably slow and expensive, no one actually uses them. OpenAI is clearly playing the hype game. I have a whole other stream on that. They're playing this whole hype game right now, trying to win benchmarks, but not actually taking things like how useful the model is into account for real-world use cases like coding. And as an aside, coding is the number one use for generative AI. It's the number one use people are using commercially, products are succeeding, etc. So anyway, all these products that generate and modify code, they are just Claude. They're all just different wrappers around Claude. And they're great. I use Cursor every day. I recommend Bolt and Lovable to people who aren't developers all the time. Windsurf is freaking awesome too. I don't use Copilot. I have a video on that. It's not that good. Especially when you compare it to Cursor and Windsurf. A lot of people I actually suggest Windsurf to these days, because Cursor is like, you have to know to use the compose mode, and then you have to make sure to switch to agent mode if you don't want to have to manually list files, which is annoying. You don't really have to do that anymore. Windsurf just kind of works by default out of the box, which is great. So these days, for a lot of people who are like, I haven't used any AI ID, I'm like, hey, use Windsurf. It's $5 a month cheaper than Cursor. It's a lot better than Copilot, at least today's. These products are always getting better all the time, but this is just the state today. Great. And yeah, if you're just somebody new trying to generate an app, I usually point them at Lovable. But just so you all know, for context, when I get asked this question about the future of, say, CMS or no code. So remember, CMS is like, back in the day, it was like WordPress. I hope you love my terrible handwriting. No code was like site builders like this Webflow. And then, AI is like those products I listed out. Let's just kind of say Bolt, because Bolt, I think, is more well-known than Lovable today. That's changing, but I think those are probably the biggest. Let's also say CMS, there's like Contentful here too, headless CMS. Those are probably the big names in each of these kind of buckets. CMS, no-code, AI. You've got WordPress, or more modern like Contentful, Webflow, Bolt. How does this all evolve? That was a question I got yesterday, and I have a lot of thoughts on this. Why? Because we make a product that's kind of in the middle here. It's sort of like, originally Builder.io was this sort of like no-code CMS. So it was sort of like a no-code like Webflow. You could plug into any site or app over an API like a Contentful with the same kind of structured data. And we have leaned heavily into AI. I'll kind of get into why that is, and code generation. We've learned a lot of stuff about like what works here and what doesn't. And there's a lot of interesting conversations that I see people having about like the future of how does a non-dev participate in the dev process beyond just writing tickets, right? Of course, if you're not a developer, you can write tickets. You can say, hey, please do this thing, or please do that thing, or whatever. But overall, how does a non-developer get involved in the dev process? So in the CMS world, they update, if it's like Contentful, they update fields. So a developer writes this page as React or whatever. It's got all this text and images and all this stuff. And then they start making these in the CMS, you get this form. These form fields will update, this text updates that, this image upload updates that, whatever. This sucks, by the way. Like, really, really, really sucks. I hate CMSs to death. Everybody hates CMSs. CMSs suck. Whatever you want to update, you need to add some button. It's not a field in the CMS. You get infinite tickets of like, oh, the marketing team wants a button here. This was my old life. I used to lead web engineering at a company called ShopStyle. It's a big e-commerce site. Never-ending tickets. Oh, we need another button. We need another image. We need an A/B test. Like, oh, shut up. And then there's like, oh, we don't have and people are like, oh, I don't know what for. It sucked. I hate CMSs. Hate. It's a horrible workflow for everybody. And again, you've got the no-code workflow, which is kind of interesting too, but a little bit too unbounded. So in a site like Webflow, there's two problems with like a Webflow. There's three for like a real business. One is it doesn't integrate with your stack. You're not going to use Webflow with React. Deal breaker for 99% of businesses immediately. But a small business, it could be fine. Issue number two is it's fucking hard to use. Like, these drag and drop editors are really freaking hard to learn. It might seem easy at first, and then you're trying to like put two buttons side by side, and like you're having to go into like these UIs with like Flexbox settings and like figure it out. You're like, I can't figure it out. If you're not a developer and you haven't learned Webflow or CSS in depth, it's really, really hard. And then third issue is it's too unbounded, unconstrained. So if you are, let's take like a builder customer. If you are like Fabletics.com or like Everlane.com, you don't want your marketing team to just do anything, right? You have components. You already have this set of components that you use to produce all the pages of the site. If you make an update to the button component, all buttons stay in line and look and feel the same. You don't want someone to just like literally just generate HTML and CSS. On the fly, no visual consistency with anything else, no reuse of components. Like, you don't want any of this. So Webflow is not really something that people use for real businesses at real scale. It's more for the smaller businesses, which is fine. People unfortunately use CMS at big scale. I fucking hate CMSs. And then there's this new thing. It's like, what if we just generate code? Like, I mentioned Webflow is hard to, with a traditional CMS, you're not going to make something net new. You're not going to like say like, oh, I want a new page to promote this new product that looks like no other page, but it still uses the design system. So it's on brand. It looks right, but it's like different layout or whatever. You're not going to do that with CMS. You will do that with no code, but it's going to be hard. It's really easy with a product like Bolt, right? So Bolt or Cursor or whatever, if you so with Cursor, you need to have access to the code base. And nobody wants a non-edge actually sending a pull request. I guarantee it, right? Nobody at Fabletics.com or whatever, name a website, wants their designers or PM sending garbage AI-generated pull requests. Hell no, do not ever want it. But if you take something like a Lovable or Bolts, where this is sort of like a separate code base, you can generate stuff really fast. Now, there's a couple problems for like a real world, like I work on a real website or app use case. One of the problems is the fact that we still need to be using our design system or our stuff. So we need to be using, let's start with what Bolt and Level can do well. I mentioned you wanted to make this new layout. You can just prompt Bolt or Lovable and say, hey, make that layout, and just like, bam, it's just going to do it. And if you're like, hey, I want to add a button here or whatever, like, bam, it's just going to do it. And like, if you use something like Webflow, you're just like, oh my God, this is crazy. But there's two giant problems here too for like I want to use this for real work, not just a prototype, which, as a side note, these are phenomenal prototyping tools. If you don't know how to code, you want to make an end-to-end prototype. Like, remember InVision back in the day where you would take these screenshots of designs and you'd have these hotspots, and when you click this hotspot, it goes to the screenshot. Don't got this shit at all anymore. You can make a prototype, and I don't think people value prototyping enough, to be clear. Like, people say they hate waterfall. People fucking love waterfall. People secretly, who are not developers, love waterfall. They love the idea of like, I'm just going to think up, I've got this idea, my idea is the perfect app, the perfect feature. And it's going to have this button that goes here, and we're going to build it and people are going to love it. And we're not going to do this like trial and error bullshit where we like ship some stuff and then see what people like, get their feedback. No, we know what people want because we're smart. We know that this is what people want. We're going to have all these meetings and we're going to talk about, oh, but it should be this way or it'd be even better. And then you have this big scope and you're like, oh, we have all these steps. Once we do all these steps, people are going to fucking love it. You know what happens? People don't love it. This drives me crazy. I've worked at too many companies who create these perfect plans of the process, the feature people are going to love, and they just assume they're going to ship it and people are going to love it. Drives me crazy. So what is the solution to that? One solution is just iterate really fast, right? Build very, very small incremental features and get feedback constantly. Like, listen, here's my ear. Listen to your damn customers. Listen to all the shit they have to say because they have valuable shit to say. They are not you and you are not them. And when you're sitting in this like 10-month meeting process and planning process, you are getting more and more detached from your users and you're not realizing it. And you're thinking that you understand them and you don't. I don't care if you've been in 1 million user conversations. You never know what they're going to like until you put something in their hands and they tell you, this doesn't make any sense. That's always what happens. And so either A, you can ship really fast and iteratively, but I'll be honest, some companies just can't do that. Maybe your product's super complex. Maybe your user base is super sensitive. You just cannot test on real users reliably. So that's where you have prototyping. You have Bolt and Lovable to do prototypes. You can try stuff out. You can get a feel for it. You can get real user feedback. It's not like real because you're not going to ship it within your existing product. And that's kind of where we get back to the problems with these. Why can't we use this for real production? Because the ideal is real production, right? We're going to actually add this feature, some basic form of this feature into the product for some percent of users or all. We're going to get their feedback and we're going to learn, we're going to iterate accordingly. Now, the problems with Bolt and Lovable today is that there's a few things. We'll talk about where I think this is going, but we're talking about the problems first. Why do none of these things really solve what we want in a way that we can just say, this is the answer. The answer's already in front of us. So issue one is it's not your existing code base. So your existing code base is where you need the feature. You need to use your components, you need to use your design system, you need to use your backends and your logic, and it's not. It's all net new. So it's a greenfield, self-contained thing. It's a prototype. It's fake. It might have real functionality, but it's not hooked up to your real data and users. Two is it is not... it won't, not that it's not just plugged in your code, but it won't even look like your stuff. Like when it's generating a design, it doesn't look right. It's essentially off-brand. And to get these things to look right is really hard. Like screenshot to code, Claude and OpenAI turning screenshots to code, very, very, not good, not good. I mean, like, yes, if you don't give a shit at all, if it looks correct to the screenshot, cool. Like if you just take a screenshot of a dashboard and use one dashboard that kind of looks reminiscent of that, cool. But if you actually want it to be correct, like this needs to look like something that is our product, it's not going to be good. And three, this is kind of most important, the way that it generates code, like any AI generates code, it puts you in this catch-22, because if the idea of Bolt and Lovables, you don't need to be a developer to generate code, but ultimately you need code in your production code base in order to get to real users to run real tests, is you can have to send a pull request, and your engineers are not going to want I'll call it a non-eng PR. They don't want a pull request by non-eng. This is kind of a non-starter. So again, amazing tool for building something on an island. It might be amazing for the first version of your product. The MVP, I don't mean a feature MVP, I mean a product MVP. You're not a developer, but you want to be an entrepreneur and you just want to create something that's amazing. That can just create that MVP for you. You can test it out. You can see if this is a viable product, and then you can build the full thing. And so he's mentioning V0 is different. It creates consistent design. Yes, but that's not your design, right? If you're a real company, you probably don't use... V0 creates consistent Vercel looking products. If your company is not Vercel, that's not useful. Again, if you are just making a prototype or just like a small, like, I am just creating a dummy application, internal application, whatever, that's fucking awesome. Like V0 creates the nicest looking stuff, and that's why I think people like it. Bolt and Lovable, I think, are getting much better at that, and with the right prompting, they can be equally as good. It's not hard. V0 just kind of has some default prompting that makes it kind of look nice by default. But the issue here, remember, is we're trying to do something for a real world use case. Like we work at a real company. If I work at Builder or J.Crew or Apple or whatever, V0 doesn't look like my product, so it doesn't help. What we need in an ideal world is something that, like, let's look at the benefits of each of these categories. For a CMS, we can actually update our site or app. So in our site or app, we are making an update. So that's cool. So when I update something in the CMS, my everlane.com site or whatever will always correctly use the everlane.com site structure, meaning it's on everlane.com. It is using our buttons and our components and our design system. And there's no coloring outside the lines, almost to a fault, but that's the beautiful thing. So what is like almost 100% of real world sites and apps use? They use a CMS. They hate it. It's a horrible experience, but it does what it needs to do. We can get simple, trivial updates live to the site or app the way that we want when we're in full control from like an engineering viewpoint. So that's great. So everybody uses CMS. They hate it, but they use it. Webflow and site builders do give you precision control. So there's this whole conversation right now of like, let's take Bolts, Lovable, etc., like AI. So I'll call this would be sort of like site builder. This is sort of like AI. There's this whole conversation now that are things like Bolts the new site builder, so to speak. What I mean by that is do Squarespace, Webflow, and all of them die because Bolt can just make anything? I'm not sure. I personally don't think so, but there's the question of, is a limitation of a Bolt, etc. today a fundamental limitation, or is it a one feature that will be solved, or a bug that'll be solved by a feature, for example? So today, what people like about a Webflow or Framer or whatever else is you have 100% precision. It is a hard learning curve. The learning curve is steep before you can actually accomplish things really down to the details you want, but you get 100% precise control. You can click on the thing that you want. You get those little outlines, the selection outline, and you can get the exact sort of CSS or whatever you want. So if you have the time to go in and make sort of precise details, it'll give you exactly what you want and need. With something like Bolt and AI, you don't have extreme precision, right? If you just need to pick a specific color, or just need to move something by like a few pixels, it's kind of a pain. Now, in an ideal world, an ideal super product probably would have elements of all three of these things. So let's talk about like hypothetical like ideals here for a second. Like this is where we're getting to like future and where I think things get really interesting for a future. So let's talk about like hypothetical future stuff. Like what does the workflow look like in the future? I'll tell you some things it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like, I'll mention it again, non-eng sending a PR. We don't want people who are engineers sending a PR. And so ideally we have something like a headless CMS where we can make updates over API with some kind of constraints. Ideally, the user interface. So let's talk about like that's the integration point. The integration is I can plug this into my site or app. I've got a React app. I have these components. I have these things. And then I want to plug the thing, but ideally it's not a CMS anymore because everybody fucking hates CMSs. I want the new thing, TM, to plug in to my site or app over an API, and I can control what it can do where. Ideally, and that's sort of like, I think, integration point for like a real site or app. Now, in terms of like UIs, I think that's another big question. What is the user experience of this new thing? If it can plug into my stuff, but I don't want to generate code, what do we do instead? And what does that UI look like? Ideally, I mean, it's easy to say like, what if we had everything? Why not both? But honestly, I think it is possible to have both. And I have some thoughts on what that could look like. But here's the sort of like why not both or why not everything answer. Is like in terms of user experience, I think what people want is they want a prompt box, right? We want to just type what we want and just see it manifest in front of our eyes. Oh, here's the UI and here's the buttons, da-da-da. But we also want to be able to click on a thing and have this sort of like advanced control. Like I want to choose a color from my palette of colors, right? I don't want to type, move this, use the blue primary 2, I don't remember the name. Like I just want to click on it and say like, I want that blue, or like this needs a little more space. I don't want to go in a prompt and say like, oh, a little more space, oh, a little less space, no, little more space. No. I literally just want to drag and move this a little bit, right? So in ideal world, we can be editing with prompts and visually, and you can pick and choose. If you're brand new beginner, you're just going to use prompts. And ideally, this system would actually be aware of our design system, right? So unlike a Bolt or Lovable, or anything Claude based. I should stop naming names because these are fantastic products each and they have fantastic use cases each. Claude. You tell Claude to make an update, it's just going to look at what it sees and replicate it. And that works pretty well too. But ideally, it knows your systems with a little bit more depth and it can just generate anything and it looks like, what you had created. You would have created your own company if you had designed it and built it yourself to some degree. Obviously, like, I don't think any of this stuff is making developers' jobs go away or any less valuable. Joe is saying need a visual diff. You talking about Builder needs a visual diff? Because that's actually, we do sort of. We don't have a good enough one, actually. But anyway, maybe you're talking in general. Joe might be talking about we need a visual diff in general, like when the AI makes updates, let's see a visual diff. But anyway, if you had the ideal UX where somebody who just wants high level, the AI can just output what you wanted on brand, and if you want low level control, you can click and modify. I think that's the ideal UI. Nobody has that today, But I think that's only a matter of time. Now, there are problems to solve. We can get into the engineering side of the problems to solve here, and maybe we'll do that. Like, why doesn't this exist? Why is this not a thing? There's a couple reasons. The first one is that code is not easy to visually edit. I've done a lot of experiments myself. You don't just sort of like take code. You don't just take code and then create a drag and drop UI on top of it. There are some cases that people have done this. So like one funny example is like, in case you don't already know, the gaming world is way ahead on visual tooling than like web and app. So if you're a web or app developer, you have no clue what, like, unless you've experimented with those on your own time, what Unreal Engine can do. Unreal Engine is crazy in terms of how you can like let's just take a AAA game. Let's take Cyberpunk 2077. Let's just find a screenshot of this game. Let's go in here. Let's go images. Basic screenshot. Let's blow this up. Cool. So that's a basic scene in Cyberpunk 2077. The level of detail in a AAA game, almost any game, truly, like even an indie game, is so far beyond the level of detail in a site or app. Like here's the website. Let's look at the website around this. Okay, we have this piece of text with a little bit of space here, and this is orange, and this is smaller font and a little more space. There's almost no details, right? So it's not shocking to me that today people handwrite this as CSS. They literally will go in and let's make a fake file here. Language mode. Let's just say HTML. They'll go in and they'll add their divs and then they'll add their style, and they'll say, I don't know how to type. They'll say like, the container has, the padding, let's go, padding, 20 pixels, You can do that because today's site and apps are pretty basic. Now this gets really tedious over time, like doing all this stuff line by line manually. But if you look at like a AAA game, there's no chance that someone would ever type this scene out by hand. It's way too detailed. Let's look at other scenes. Like the scene is like the sort of like page, equivalent in a site or app. Actually, these are renderings. Let's do a real, let's say gameplay. Let's do a real gameplay screenshot. It's crazy. It's just like one of a million examples. I mean, the level of detail here is insane. Like, let's go in here. And this, I just picked a random game here. But like, you would never hand code this every single like strand of hair on this person's head and the colors and the differences in every little change. There's no chance. And so what does Unreal Engine do? It gives you visual tools. You can import, a model, and then you can go into like a scene builder and you can actually put, the model here and set the light comes from over here. You can navigate the game world like the game user is doing, but the car here and, here's the road. We're going to apply this texture here, yada, yada, yada. You can go in and visually set this up. And this is manipulating like C++ objects. This is, in a sense, reading and writing code. But there's no world that the code could have been written all by hand for this level of detail. And so there's one other equivalent in like apps too. So if you go to like Swift UI and you're editing, this is pretty cool, by the way. Native apps are definitely ahead of web apps in this regard as well. If you go to a native app and you have Xcode open and you have Swift UI code, what's really cool is you can have Swift UI code, and then you can have a preview of the Swift UI code, and you can actually like select things on the screen and like edit their properties, and it'll read and write the code. So it'll go back and you'll have, here, let's go to Claude real quick and let's get a piece of Swift UI code. Give me a Swift UI component for a login page. And so let's look at what this code looks like. Too bad Cloud Artifacts can't preview a Swift UI component. There we go. Okay, beautiful. So this is good enough. It does have some styling. Perfect. So what's really cool, and actually Swift UI can have like padding and colors. Yeah. So what's really cool is you can have, let's say this is Xcode. And you can then have this code in a rendered preview, you could click something, you can change the padding value, and it'll go back and update the code with that padding value. Super cool. So that's probably a closer comparison for like web and app development, which is you can be editing the no code version and the code version side by side. It's going to read and write and update the code. Now the reality is this is super limited. You have to like manually set up these previews. It's usually simple at first, and I'm not a deep native programmer, but I've used tools like this so long that I can only guess that it gets less simple over time as you go deeper into these things. But there are some tools out there where you can read and write code, but none of them read and write raw code. So you're never going to just literally just write code however you want to code, and then you see a preview of it, and then you can start visually updating Webflow style, and we're just going to update the code for you just like a developer would have done. That's something that just never, it will never exist. The reason why, I've done lots of experiments. I've made this open source project. Let me show you. I've made a variety of open source projects. Mitosis is kind of a project that explores this, but the big learning you have there is that you have to have constraints. The only way to visually edit like components is you have to have constraints, like raw source code. And so Mitosis is a pretty constrained syntax intentionally to allow for translation to other frameworks as well as visual manipulation. I created this other project called Build. In the past, Builder.io, Build. Really interesting. Here it is. So this was an experiment to make just normal TypeScript code visually editable. So it would do read and write from the TypeScript AST. So it's like, let's parse the TypeScript code to an abstract syntax tree, which is what compilers use. It's a tree of objects that describes the code. And let's give you UI around that, let you visually manipulate that. And what we could do is we can identify higher level patterns automatically and identify like simpler UIs for certain patterns. It was cool, it was interesting, it would never have worked. Like all things, I try and get an experiment out, try and get some feedback, try and test it on users, and rise too quickly. This is just too complicated. The problem is code is just too unbounded. There's just too many things you can do, and it's too unstructured in terms of like what a non-developer needs to work with. So there's no world where we can just read and write any code anyway. And again, there's no world where we're going to deliver any code to a site or app over an API. If we go back and we talk about like, hey, if we don't want non-developers sending a pull request, then we need to update parts of a site or app without pull requests, without like raw source code updating. And so, oh yeah, there are. So by the way, people are pointing out, there have been examples for the web where you can do bidirectional code updating. So Microsoft Front Page was one. Visual Basic was another one. Some of the, like Microsoft has actually done a lot here. Like if you've noticed, Visual Studio Code, etc. These products have UIs, right? These are like IDEs that had UIs, Xcode 2. And so I think Microsoft always been in the language Visual Basic, has always been on this kick of like, let's visually update code. The problem is these things have never really worked at scale because of all of the challenges of having full coding flexibility and the right constraints that make the UIs easy to work with. And so let's experiment. There are versions, like let's imagine we want to sort of like hot swap code somehow. Like we have a website and let's say we want some section to be powered by a CMS no code AI thing. So, and we'll get into why some of these other sort of combinations have challenges too, and where I think this goes and what I think can come of it, which I think is kind of exciting. But let's say we want this section of this website to be kind of controlled by some other tool, like over an API. So one thing you can do is you can do sort of like dynamic code delivery. That is ripe with security challenges, as well as making sure it's performant, make sure it works truly natively and seamlessly. This is kind of funky. Just straight up deliver code. We experiment with this. The code needs to also evaluate server side, which has its own issues. So what you can do instead of just like full on code delivery is you can do like, there's this thing that Facebook does. It's really cool. I forget if they have a name for it. They do have a name for it. They call it blocks. It's really cool. React blocks. secret internal project at Meta. Really, really neat. So what this is, React blocks. So let's take Instagram. For Instagram, what React blocks lets developers do is a backend dev in Python can code up a React UI, including functionality, and can deliver that over API and update the UI accordingly. So what this means is you have a native app downloaded to your phone, the Instagram app, but the marketing team at Instagram wants to add some kind of like banner to the UI, and it has some unique UI, some combination of images, buttons, text that has never existed before. So it's not pre-downloaded on the app. Remember, when we're dealing with native apps, we're dealing with like code that's already been downloaded. You cannot just hit refresh on the native app and it has the latest code, right? So for you web developers out there who are like me, you're just used to like, yeah, everybody's got the latest version of the site or app at all times. Native apps, not the case. And that's a huge pain point. If we just want to deliver a new banner to people on version whatever, some old version of the app, we need some way to deliver new UIs with functionality without updating the code. So this React blocks project created this sort of like, it's sort of like you could call it almost like an intermediate representation, almost like an AST. It's basically this JSON format that can encapsulate UIs that uses their design system. So it's sort of like, let's kind of mock this out here. It's sort of like language mode, TypeScript. It's sort of like if you had something like this. That is like, let's just kind of define our payload as this. And it's like blocks. And then you've got, components, hero, and props, title, hello world, right? We could dynamically say, we want the hero, here. And then it probably has some styling. So style. I don't know the internals of React blocks, by the way. I'm just guessing, and I'll explain why I think this is an educated guess. So you've got some styling, right? And this might be smart enough to not just take raw values, but take things like something more like a design token, like, R black or R primary or whatever, right? Some kind of variable notation. Color, let's do like text primary, you get the idea. But here's the really cool part. In React blocks, you can also define actions. Somehow this knew that. But here's the important part. So let's say the hero, let's say it has a button action. But the crazy part is it cannot just take code. You can't just send code over the wire and eval it. That would be crazy. That's too much. So what it has to do is it has to send something like an AST. So people might call this an abstract syntax tree or an intermediate representation. It needs to basically be like let's look at an AST really quickly. Let me show you what the hell an AST. If you don't know this website called astexplorer.net, you're missing out in life. If you've ever worked on a Babel plugin, a linting plugin, or anything, AST Explorer is how you see how code turns into objects, the abstract syntax tree. So let's do some TypeScript, TypeScript. Oh, already doing TypeScript, great. And so I'm gonna have to zoom out here a little bit because these are big objects. Anyway, what's amazing about AST Explorer is not just you type code, sorry, let me make sure this is all in view. So not just typing code, const foo equals hi. And it can be super complex code, right? Function, foobar, return, foo, all the different expressions you can have. But you can click on stuff and you can see how this is represented in the tree. So this is a program represented in objects. So I'm going to move this out of the way for a second and let's focus on the objects here. So this is a source file. So this is a program. Some people like Babel, I think, calls this a program. So this represents the root of a chunk of code. And then at the root level, it takes an array of statements. So statement one is a variable statement. It's declaring. Now, what's funny is this also reminds me of how JavaScript syntax works. Remember, declarations, you can have multiple. So a declaration is not a singular thing. A declaration, a variable statement, is actually always a declaration list, because you can also say bar equals yo. So these things are always a declaration list, even though you probably generally only write a single declaration at a time. At least I hope so. I do not like declaring things as lists. But anyway, This is an AST, it represents anything you could write in JavaScript or TypeScript, and so it needs to handle a list because JavaScript TypeScript takes a list of declarations. So the first declaration is this variable declaration, which is its own type of object, and then the name is the left-hand side. That's an identifier, and it's just the text foo, and the initializer is a string literal. This, again, of course, instead could be a number, and that would just be a numeric literal. And then it has the text value of 2. Going down, you have a function declaration, and then the name of the function is this identifier foobar. Easy way to think of identifier in this context is just anything that doesn't have quotes around it. Any text that's not a keyword or have quotes around it, it's not a string. And then the body of the function only has a return statement that returns the identifier foo. And so looking back at our code, that's exactly what we had. So this is an example of code represented as objects. Now, you can do a lot of cool stuff with this. When code is represented as objects, you can compile it to another language, for instance, as long as the languages are of a similar abstraction level. So you can transpile this JavaScript to Python, ish. Obviously, there's a lot of different sort of semantics and nuanced behaviors, but generally speaking, ish, you can compile this from one language to another. Super cool. But the other cool thing you could do is you can interpret this. So you could write an interpreter that loops over these objects and says, oh, variable declaration, I'm going to store this value for this key in some memory object. Oh, function declaration, I'm going to create in memory, like a reusable routine that just interprets, it loops over these objects and does what it says to do. So if I have const foo equals 2 plus 2, your interpreter would need to know how to add 2 plus 2. So it'll see, let's click on this, it'll see that we have a binary expression. That's anything with 2 things and an operator. The operator token is the plus token, so that means it's a mathematical addition expression, and we can add those things. So you could write a program that takes this object and evaluates it. Now, that can be slow, but that's only concerningly slow if the program is sufficiently complex. So if you just need an interpreter, back to our example of React blocks, if the action is just, so let's maybe do it kind of compiler-y format. We're going to say the first statement is type, let's just say binary expression. And we can just really copy that AST. We'll say operator is plus, and we'll say like, yeah, there we go. Left identifier A, right literal 1. Great. This is actually a more Babel looking. Babel is a little bit simpler than TypeScript and how their AST looks, but you could send this over the wire. So here's JSON we could send over the wire, and we could have parts of an application, use our components, have logic within whatever constraints we want. No code is evaluated, but we can actually ship things, new features, new functionality, new UIs over the wire without code. And that's really interesting in my opinion. So the Instagram app can send things, your React blocks can send things over the wire that look like that. And the coolest part is this is language agnostic. And so what Meta has is they have ways to write like Python or I forget what other languages they support. I believe PHP as well, where you can write these components in a nicer syntax. So I'll keep using JavaScript here for a second, but I'm gonna guess that the syntax looks something a little bit better. Like for example, maybe the syntax looks like const payload equals, and maybe it is literally like, hero with the props like title, and let's change this language mode JavaScript so that I don't get type complaints. Const, we'll call this, let's delete that other stuff. So payload looks something nice, and it might be like on click, and it might be like, print 2 plus 2. And then you could parse this to the AST that then could be interpreted on the client. So this is like the easy, nice mode. But check this out. Here's the interesting thing about this whole approach related to what we're talking about is when you have this sort of like structured world, we talked about like the problem with having UIs that can update things in code is you need certain structure. So if you have more structure, because you need to send this over the wire anyway and interpret it over the wire, then you're potentially solving multiple problems in one here. So let's go back over here and say, hey, let's say we had this structure, this JSON structure, that we can send over the wire like React blocks and update parts of a site or app. So now we can have people make updates to this section within whatever rules and constraints that we want. It has to follow the design system. You can't add arbitrary imperative logic that would break the site or app, blah, blah, blah. And now we can update this thing without pull requests and without development. And let's say that thing doesn't have to be coded like you see here, but you can use a UI for that. Let's say it's like a Webflow style UI. So with the Webflow UI, you have the full kind of precision. Oh my goodness, I have like my first Twitch follower ever. For those of you who don't know, I have a Twitch account. Nobody goes to it. Nobody knows it exists because it's like a cold start problem. How's anybody know? I guess I don't promote it anywhere. I don't like mention I have a Twitch. But anyway, got my first comment from a Twitch user ever. What is up, Diggs? Anyway, if you guys like Twitch, you can go follow me on Twitch. I should be Steve8708 there. I'm Steve8708 everywhere. In case you don't know what 8708 is, it's the last 4 digits of my phone number. Don't try and guess the rest. I don't want random text from the homies watching the stream. But anyway, so let's say you could have like a Webflow style drag and drop UI that can read and write that JSON. Then you could have, and let's say that Webflow UI could understand the constraints as well. Could understand that we need to use only our hero component, our button. If we want it to have logic, it has a certain amount of, limits into what kind of logic you can do, what kind of actions you allow the system to take. And then that basically updates that JSON format that can update the site or app. So you can just drag, drop, publish. But we already established that dragging, dropping kind of sucks. It's just hard. It's unintuitive. In fact, most of the time, you're probably getting these marketing ideas from Figma. You're over in Figma, and so that's my terrible job at a Figma logo. You're in Figma and you have these designs, and ideally, you'd want the Figma design to be able to pump in, as long as it's matching using your design system, etc., pump in and then update this. Ultimately update that site or app at the end of the day. Now, that would be a bit of a dream, but again, we talked about UIs are hard anyway. Even Figma can be hard. If you want to make it actually properly responsive, you should probably use auto out, blah, blah, blah. So then taking things a step further, a magical ideal would be we could also edit this stuff with AI. So let's say you had that cool JSON format that can do all the things React blocks does. But then not just with UI, AI can update that too. Now, in my experience, AI is okay at updating structured data that's hierarchical, yada, yada. It's better at code. So if you can do like React blocks does and have a structure that makes sense. And honestly, the thing that AI is really good at is this is live. So the thing that AI is really good at is JSX. So in an ideal world, this format we use let's see if it'll update the rest. AI is cool. I'm using cursor for this, by the way. Anyway, ideally, the format we use is just JSX because AI is great at manipulating JSX, even if you give it additional rules. We've shown with the quick framework, you could tell it what the additional rules are. And as long as it knows, here's JSX and here's the additional rules, it's pretty cool. Dang, Twitch people are telling me that the stream is not showing up. This always happens. I use this thing called Restream to stream to multiple platforms. For some reason, Twitch, it never shows up. That's a bummer. I appreciate people are showing up and commenting, but I guess the stream isn't showing up. Anyway, and so now what's cool is you can use, this is actually kind of fun. So you can use an open source project like Mitosis. Mitosis is the only one that I know about. I made the dang thing because I couldn't find an alternative. But Mitosis, you can write JSX that can be turned back and forth into JSON, a pretty clean JSON format. And so here I can manipulate all this stuff. It's a little bit hard to see the JSON. Let's show the meaty stuff. Anyway, this is all JSON representing what I have here. You can update the JSON and the code updates back. So one thing you could theoretically do is you can use mitosis for all this stuff that I'm talking about, which is you have JSON that you can add whatever functionality, and the functionality updates the JSON. I think mitosis is probably the closest thing to an open source React blocks that exists, where you have the JSON format, you have a nice syntax for developers, but you have the JSON side, which can be edited with UI, etc. But the funny thing is AI is trained on code. So the AI, in my experience, you want it to update the JSX format. So if this format we're talking about can be updated like bidirectionally to JSX, so convert to JSX, AI updates it, convert back to objects, and go, I think that would be the dream. If we got to this world, then we would have this hypothetical world where you actually could have that sort of like magical land where you've got the developers, and I'll say people who are not developers, working together, where whatever sites, apps, etc. Like let's take the React blocks example again. Let's take the Instagram example again. You can have, yeah. So you can have a world where, like in the Instagram app, obviously not anybody can update anything they want anywhere in the Instagram app. You're going to have like areas that can be modified. You're going to have parts of the app. Let's say, I'm trying to think of like what an example is, but maybe there's an area near the top that's like an optional banner. The optional banner can then be over the API. I can ping and say like, oh, is there a banner for today for this user? If there is, we're going to render out the banner exactly as it's specified. This is sort of a great world. Now, in the world of Instagram and the world of Meta, this is actually a back-end team, and this is actually a front-end team. So the front-end team controls the UI. A specific back-end team pumps things into that UI. But in our case, we're not talking about developers. We're talking about somebody who's not a developer. Like, hey, if I wanted a bolt or lovable, but I could generate a page within an existing site, and we don't have to go through pull requests, and we don't want to have to like release or update code to add a marketing banner or whatever, then you have the non-dev, we'll call them the ND, and the dev, we'll just say dev, working in a harmonious way. You're carving off parts of the site or app that the non-dev can edit. A simple example is it's the home pages, right? Every website's got a home page. Every home page is just marketing. So do you really want to have tickets to update the home page? Probably not. We want to update this copy. We want to add this cool new banner. We'll happily use the components we already have. Like that's kind of a dream. Another example is net new pages. For like e-commerce, that would be like a landing page. They call LPs. In a bunch of other cases, like you just want to make some net new pages, / about or whatever, / some promo. And you just want people who are not developers to update this. You want them to follow your rules, but in an ideal world, they will generate, we can pump those updates over an API like React blocks. So the API works like React blocks. You can use AI to generate that stuff, and the AI is aware of the design system components, etc. And then from there, you can then use a UI, a GUI, to make the fine controls. I want to change the spacing. I want to change this color. I want to drag and drop this image in. I don't want to have to go to AI for everything. If I'm an advanced user, I might primarily use UI. If I am a not advanced user, I might primarily use AI. And the delivery mechanism is a JSON format over an API like React blocks. That's sort of, I think, a dream scenario. And then let me tell you, like, if we can achieve this, what that unlocks, because I think that's where like the future of like the workflow comes into place, and why it's really interesting, and why I don't think CMSs are not solving this, because they do not actually do anything interesting with AI, visual editing, and like a React blocks like format for delivery, that more advanced JSON with the interpreter, yada yada. Webflow and site builders, the next step for them is obviously to add AI. Now, they've been very slow. Even Framer doesn't do a lot with AI right now. Like, really, it's nowhere near. Like, Bolt and Lovable, those are, and Cursor, miles different. There is just no site builder comparison, and not even remotely CMS comparison. Like, it's just miles different. Why? Because Bolt and Lovable use Claude to edit code. Now, if you had something like React Bricks and like a mitosis JSX format, you could probably do something much much more like Lovable and Bolt in a CMS or Webflow format. I'll get back to that because I think that's sort of like where this stuff ultimately goes. But the innovation here has not been great. There's a lot of technical reasons why, but I think it's 100% solvable personally. And so really, I think what we want is something like Lovable and Bolt. Again, some of the UIs of this, but delivery kind of over this. Now, let's say we do achieve that. I think that's where things get really interesting. You're not just saving on engineering workloads, right? Engineers, in my experience, still need to own all the complicated parts of the site's and app. There's no world where the AI over an API is producing the majority of the site and or app. The reality of this, I think, is that you're instead going to have like divide up your site or app into sort of like pages or sections. And maybe like the header and footer, you might want like some team that's not engineering to be able to modify without engineering tickets. That would be nice. And without an overly constraining CMS, they can just make the update they need, run it as a test, whatever. Other parts, the more advanced parts, the dashboard, CRM, tables and charts and whatever. Yeah, that should be in code. That should not be owned by someone who's not a developer. That would be crazy, in my opinion. And that's where you can have this divide. Now, if you have that structure, the ability for an API to deliver parts of your site or app dynamically, then you start to realize when you take into account where AI is going, it doesn't, and like AI agents, that's where things get interesting in my opinion, because then, the original use case of this was, a non-dev to be able to update. So we need the infrastructure to deliver and we need a UI to update. But what if we didn't use the UI to update? What if we used AI to update? And I don't mean the way you're thinking, a way where you have an individual prompting to make updates. What if it was like an agent? It was like auto prompting itself. Like you have this, because you have this mechanism to, let's say, like dynamically deliver a homepage based on what a user in a UI created. What if instead of that being, say the user with the UI, the import from Figma, the prompt with the AI, that just becomes the version 1 of that page. And then the AI can start modifying from there. This could look like a number of forms, right? Like if you think about agents and AI doing its own thing, I don't think agents are going to come be coders anytime soon. But if you don't take the large use cases and instead you shrink down to like the small use cases and say like, okay, what about basic stuff? A/B test to the homepage. While agents are probably not going to be writing sophisticated software tomorrow, they probably could make A/B test updates to the homepage. That could be in a couple versions too. This could be like a Slack conversation where you're talking amongst yourselves about like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if the homepage did like XYZ thing, new thing? And then there's probably a not too distant world where you tag like at some bots, let's call it like the Builder bot, and say like, hey, read this thread and make that update. And the bot can just go do that. They can just read the thread. It's very easy for LLMs to summarize a thread right now. And say, hey, this thread is kind of overall, the overarching opinion here is clearly to like, add a different color scheme or different button or whatever to the homepage. So I'm going to go apply that. I can automatically roll that out as a 5% test because we already talked about with the React block structure, we can just make an update to the site or app over an API with a JSON format. And then I'll come back, let's say 2 days later and reply to the thread, the bot will, and say, hey, I ran that as a 5% test. That idea sucked. Didn't work. Or like, hey, that actually worked well. We saw higher conversions. If it can do all that, then it could also automatically scale things up. So if the bot sees it works, it could take that 5% test and automatically scale it up to 100%. And that would be pretty awesome. So that's a cool future world that I think will exist, a workflow that I think will exist. You literally you tag a bot in Slack and say, you're having a conversation in Slack. There's an idea that seems cool. You tag the bot to go test the idea. We're back to the idea of like iterative testing is best. Don't overly plan. If you have an idea, let's see what the numbers are. Let's see how the users respond. Let's see how this actually manifests in terms of like usefulness to a real user. And then decide there without more design by committee and stuff like that. So that would be one really cool world. But if you can do that, then you can also have the AI auto-optimize. So let's say you've got that V1 of the homepage, and let's say Slack bots can update whatever you want, whenever you want, to tell you how it performs. Cool. But what if it could automatically start making test variations? For example, personalize it to different audiences. If this stuff's coming over an API, then all you got to do is send to the API, like, audience equals like menswear shoppers, right? So this is sort of like the men's, this is the women's variants, and this is the defaults. If you're sending that to the API, then the AI can either in real time or after the fact, it can. Oh, this is actually a good question, by the way. Will Devin accomplish this? There's a specific reason no, and I'll go into that. So yeah, hit me. I don't want to ramble forever, so chat. Hit me with questions, comments, feedback you have. If you think I'm crazy, a lot of why I'm streaming this is I want to know, where do you think I'm wrong? Where do you think this doesn't make sense? Where do you think, there are other tools that I should be considering, or ideas I should be considering, or just general like questions you have. But anyway, let's say the AI can generate for you automatically a women's, men's, and default variant for this page because it knows just enough about your business and these different audiences to do that. That'd be cool too. And then it can look at the data on what performed better than others and scale them up. So let's say the men's version is working great, the women's version is not, and the default is good. Then it could scale the men's version up to 100% of those who fit sort of the menswear shoppers audience that you have set up in a customer data platform, manually, whatever. And then everybody else sees the default because the women's one didn't work. And then it can iterate and say like, well, let's try another women's variation. And it can iterate until it finds it just makes things better. That I think is inevitable too. I think this is 100% inevitable to happen. There are some precursor steps to get here, but I very much think we'll make a version of a page or whatever. AI will automatically make variations of that and find ones that work better. Now, keep in mind, AI is bad at marketing, but it is good at transforming data. Meaning, if you have examples of menswear and womenswear versions of something that performed, and you have information about how to sort of like better target the message to this audience, I think that can work really well. What I don't think could work well is just like come up with ideas, just randomly make A/B test ideas that'll work better. That's how you get generic awful marketing, right? Remember, AI is trained on the median of information out in the world. It's an average, a statistical averaging of everything it sees. And the worst marketing is the stuff that looks like everything else on the internet. It's going to be bad. Most of the internet is bad marketing. Most of the internet is more than 5 years old. And so when AI is looking at the internet and giving you generic 5-year-old looking marketing, it's going to perform badly. So I don't think AI is going to be a smart marketer. I do think it can personalize though, and I think this variation can work better. But that's where things get one step more interesting, and where I think this ultimately goes. There's a major engineering bottleneck here. So let's be clear on that. But I think that bottleneck will be solved one day, which is, well, if you can personalize based on cohorts, like different audiences, menswear shopper, womenswear shopper, default, etc. The thing that we can do once we get more, let's call it lower cost or higher efficiency LLMs. So this might come from hardware like Grok or Cerebrus are showing they can do way faster, cheaper inference by LLM optimized hardware. This may come from smaller models. I think some people call them SSMs. I think that stands for small stupid model, but some of these are getting pretty smart. And say some other innovations get to the point where we can actually generate things on the fly. Now, I did an experiment. I made this thing called bestofweb.builder.io, where this website, it caches, well, this website generates in real time as you browse it. But keep in mind, it does also cache. So the problem though is when you have a website that generates in real time as you browse it, once the crawlers got wind of this and Googlebot and others started crawling the site, I was getting a $4,000 a day Anthropic bill. That was unsustainable and unfeasible. And yes, to answer Antoine's question, yes, we'd be feeding analytics in. So a platform like Builder or whatever can look at the performance of these variations and feed the analytics in, the conversion rate, etc. But anyway, right now it's not feasible to generate this stuff in real time, but we're probably not that far from when we can. So by that far, I mean like a few years, not like a few days or months. So let's say if the AI can take a user and say, hey, I know these things about you, and I know the default version of the page, and actually generate in real time the best possible page for you. That is, I think, pretty exciting future. So again, if you have a structure like React blocks. Um, and their JSON structure where you can dynamically deliver stuff without code updates. And then you have the ability for an LLM to make and modify these things based off of criteria it knows. You could get to a world of like one-to-one personalization where everybody visits the site and they all see the website uniquely generated for them. There's a few ways that can work, but I 100% think that this is sort of like where things will ultimately go. Now, let me actually get to the chat. There's some interesting stuff going on in the chat, and I've been ignoring the chat way too much. So one question is, would it look like this? Fully functional website in seconds. Image to websites, I think there's a million of these things. I think the problem with image to website is these things aren't super duper accurate. The ideal, I think, would be people wants to, going back over here, like I think in this structure where we can dynamically say, hey, this part of a website is controlled over an API, so it can be AI generated. Most companies don't want an image to website just because those things don't have enough accuracy today in terms of fidelity, using the exact correct proportions and paddings and colors and responsive details. But people do often want Figma to website. Like, just have a Figma design that can just pump in here and just hit publish. That is a huge one I see people always wanting. Let's see. Oh yeah, so there's a lot of questions about like, well, where does cursor fit, this and that. That's where, again, we have this kind of divide. We have the engineers and we have the non-eng. In my opinion, the engineers should just use cursor as their default daily driver, right? Just use cursor to write code, to update code, all that stuff, anytime that you want. And so in this case, cursor is a great tool for coders. And in this case, the cursor updates are going through GitHub and you're deploying through GitHub Actions or whatever. This is the standard workflow that you're going to use as an engineer. And I don't think that's going to change. Like, one person asked about Devin. Is Devin capable of doing this? The problem with Devin is it works through code and pull requests as opposed to over an API. So maybe a world where if Devin is able to solve that sort of like React blocks style sort of AST that can deliver over API, and they have sort of like integrations and all this stuff, that I think would be something that maybe Devin could do in the future. But Devin doesn't seem to be built for that use case. Devin is specifically trying to be an engineer, right? Devin is trying to do this workflow, but without cursor. Just you get a GitHub pull request. And I have another video on, I hate that workflow. I think in the future that will be useful sometimes. And we tried. I hadn't shared this update, but in the Builder team, I asked about like 10 different people to try Devin for a variety of workflows. I definitely emphasized try it for simple things, etc. And people tried, and I had a number of people trying Devin, and everybody failed. We had a couple cool successes with like README updates and like super simple fixes, but rarely could get the thing to work hardly at all. Now, it will get better over time, but people overall hated the workflow. Cursor, alternatively, and also Windsurf is great too. Let me make that clear. Cursor and Windsurf are freaking great. Both really, really great options. I find Windsurf is a little easier for someone new to AI IDs, and Cursor is like marginally better at some things. More and more, I find myself recommending Windsurf. If you're not already using Cursor, I recommend using Windsurf. It's $5 a month cheaper. It uses the good stuff by default. You don't have to know to use the composer view with the agent mode selected and turn the setting on to make sure the agent mode is sticky. Blah, blah, blah. There's a bunch. It's like Cursor with a bunch of configuration is great, or just use Windsurf and has all the right configuration by default. And the UIs are kind of better too. But anyway, Cursor's freaking great too. I don't think you can go wrong with either of these products at all, especially if you know how to set up Cursor. So in this world, you're writing, committing code. And I think there's a future world where something like a Devin is submitting pull requests from time to time. I think in the future it could help with sort of like refactorings and stuff like that. So that could be nice. Update these tests, yada, yada. The non-engineer is going to be using something like let's just call it Bolt and Lovable for like prototyping. Now the thing is, let's actually talk about the downsides of the stuff. I didn't even talk about the downsides of what I talked about. And yes, all the stuff is using Claude. Everything is, this is Claude, this is Claude, this is Claude, everything's Claude. OpenAI is touting O1 is the world's smartest model and O3 is coming. Nobody's using it. People are using Claude. Because O1 is just stupidly expensive. Yes, you could throw more compute at things and it can get marginally better sometimes, but it doesn't mean it's actually useful. I have a whole other stream of 2-hour stream ranting on that from yesterday. But anyway, so lovable bolt for prototyping. And then some type of like CMS-y, hybrid-y, Webflow-y, whatever AI thing for like the sort of updating and especially iterative updating, like AI that can kind of generate parts of the site and app, etc. Let's see. This comment seems interesting. Sam says, been dreaming of an AI tool like Bolt or V0 that also has drag and drop UI builder for customization and precision. Yes. So instead of React code generate, it generates JSON for the UI builder. Yes, 100%. So this is here. Let me explain a little bit of like where I think the products are going here. And where I think some of the downsides are too. So I can give you the insider look. So at Builder.io, I'll tell you what we're working on right now. We're working on exactly what Sam is describing, which is like you have, so here's how what we do works under the hood and how this tries to tackle a lot of what I'm describing. And it has pros and cons. I'll get to the cons here too. So under the hood, Builder essentially uses mitosis, which is what I mentioned, a JSX syntax that AI is great at updating, that reads and writes to a JSON format that can be delivered over the wire. So here's like, if you want to see like an example, like technologically, like how you can do a chunk of what I'm talking about, how Builder works is we've got the JSX formats, that is JSX code, mitosis code, that read and writes from a JSON format. The JSON formats, let me clear myself some space here. Erase, goodbye. The JSON format can be delivered over an API to an SDK. So we have like a React SDK. The React SDK has this like content component where you pass in the JSON and it renders all that stuff out. And so the JSON is also editable over a UI. So that's the idea. You have V0, Bolt, Cursor, whatever style editing with AI. So this is actually the other important piece, AI. So the JSON can turn to JSX, which the AI can modify and back to the JSON. So what do you get? You basically, what you get out of this, and I'll tell you what works well today and what doesn't. What you get out of this is a visual tool where you have like the chat on the left that you can prompt to modify. The visual tool it's aware of your components. Like there's a way you annotate and point out, hey, I've got a hero component and a button and blah, blah, blah. And the AI will use your components and it'll render. So everything it renders here is exactly like your site, your app, your components, all that. You also have the point and click drag and drop UI. So you can just select something and then edit it, change the color, change the prop, change the action, et cetera, et cetera. And that all delivers over an API, so these updates, your AI can pump updates into your existing sites and apps without the need for pull requests. So you can just throw out that 5% test. That's what exists today. The AI portion is rolling out. It's in sort of like a public-private beta phase. We're hoping to be 100%. We're hoping to be 100% rolled out. The AI features by end of this month, end of January. So in that world, you have Claude updating UIs, and you can push that over an API. And that's pretty cool. And you can visually edit it as well. And I'm hoping that others like Webflow and Framer do this at some point too. So you can have the drag and drop UIs like Sam's talking about for the precision editing, but the AI to edit. I think Webflow and Framer will eventually have this. I don't know how. I think the unlock for us is the mitosis project. We built everything on top of this mitosis structure. So we kind of get some of the stuff for free. But anyway, that's sort of a big piece. And in this world, you can also take screenshots or Figma design. So the Figma design can import the screenshot, like whatever you want. AI, drag and drop, deploy to any production project. That's sort of the idea. Now, where are there still things that you not use that for? So Cursor is still going to be, and Windsurf is still going to be what you want to use for coding. This is definitely a tool you don't use for coding. Now, there's an exception, which is like that workflow I mentioned, where you can have, say, like start with a Figma design, which becomes JSON, which becomes mitosis code, which can become any framework. This powers Figma to code. So if you're ever confused, like Builder as a product is both a CMS and Figma to code, They're like, what does this have to do with each other? Well, it's the diagram I showed here, my really ugly diagram. Maybe I can redraw it a little bit prettier. It's the fact that Figma is one potential input. So I mentioned that JSON again, right? The JSON that can deliver over an API to your existing site or app using your components. But it can also, like, we built our own model to import Figma to that JSON. There's the UI that can read and write that, like the visual editing. So drag and drop UI. And then we have the AI that can read and write too. So AI and UI are read and write. But the other thing we have is code generation output. So let me move this over. So they can also output as just code, right? So you can take the Figma design in. I'll take a screenshot here as well. You can take a screenshot, or I'll just say an image. An image, bam, right? So if you want to, the JSON format is really sort of the gate between everything. So if you want to bring a Figma design in and export to code, great. Works great for that. If you want to bring a Figma design in and deploy it to your existing site or app over an API, great. Works great for that. That's how Everlane, I'm not trying to go to Vercel.com. That's how Everlane, Fabletics, a bunch of like builder customers, like that's what they do. They could just take a Figma design and just publish it to their homepage. That is sort of like the CMS structure. Anything could be edited with a UI. So you can like import from Figma, make tweaks to UI using, drag and drop, tweak the responsiveness or whatever, and then get the code or deploy over an API. And then everything can use AI. And the structure of all of this is it uses your components. And that's the other important piece. So like, let's go to Everlane again as an example. All this stuff that is here, this is created by Builder, deployed over that API, just like React blocks. But this is like using their components. So their designs from Figma, etc., their icons and iconography, their carousel components. It's kind of cool in that way. So all this stuff works. It's not all kind of like made bespoke every single time. The AI is the one piece that's coming soon, but that's honestly the most important piece. That's the piece where like you can just say what you want, it generates, and in that case, you can use your components, you can use your APIs, stuff like that. So this is what we're working on. I'm talking about the future that I think will exist. This is what we're charging towards. Now, once we have this AI piece in, that's where we want to try and explore. And there's other people exploring this too, by the way. But that's where we want to explore the like, hey, automatically run A/B tests on content, automatically personalize, one-to-one personalization. There are other products right now experimenting with that using hacky JavaScript. So there are some products that say like, hey, our AI will auto-optimize your site by running these A/B tests or personalizing. But what they do is they use hacky JavaScript. They add an inline blocking JavaScript that reads the page as DOM and then injects it, like hot swaps text out. Terrible for performance, very limited on what it can do. They say it works, like it generates better results 80% of the time or something. I don't really buy that. I mean, everybody's marketing themselves. They're going to like exaggerate the positives. That's on their own like marketing website or whatever. I'm skeptical of this. Now, I still think, and let me actually talk about, I want to share like a semi-secret thing with y'all. I hope I won't get in trouble from our partners, but we're working on a very, very interesting thing right now, which is an integration also with Lovable. So the other cool thing, because you can ingest things and output, one cool thing you'll be able to do soon is take a Figma design, and then, man, that does not look like a good Figma. I need to get better at drawing some kind of Figma F. That's a little bit better. A Figma design and convert it to like Lovable. So if you just want to turn a Figma design into an app, that is actually, like we talked about one issue with these like Lovable bolts, etc., is they're not actually high fidelity, your exact UI. It's not your exact design, it's not your exact brand, a design system. Then, just prompting or uploading a screenshot, it won't get you accurate enough. It's just going to be like sort of like your UI, but not quite, and that's kind of a problem. Now, if you're actually taking a true, what is Pigma? Yes, this is my Pigma logo. A true Figma design. Hold on, let's try this again. We're going to make a Figma logo. Okay, so it's like an F. Okay, and then it's got like one hump, two hump. Okay, something like that. There we go, Figma. Okay, so you've got your Pigma. If you can import Pigma to Lovable, and something we're potentially exploring with, let's call it others like Bolt or Cursor or Windsurf, then you can actually get full-on end-to-end apps. So I would say like the Figma to Builder is, with the AI and the UIs and all that good stuff, is really good for portions of sites and apps. You might make a dashboard, you might make a marketing page, you get all the things we talked about. You can A/B test it, personalize it, you can get UIs and prompting, blah, blah, blah. But it's not going to make you a full end-to-end app. And any of this stuff, which is cool, can export as code. But the focus of Builder as a platform is more like component level. It's like this component, this page, this whatever. Something like Lovable is like a full app. So if you want to turn a Figma design into a full app, that is where like this integration could be really interesting, which is basically Builder powers this Figma to Lovable. It's using Builder's import from Figma and generate code functionality into Lovable. That I think will be really interesting. But anyway, let me get back to the chat. There's been some interesting stuff. Jean says check out LCM. LCM LLM? What is LCM LLM? I will say, large concept models. Super interesting. If this works, I do think this will be a big, interesting innovation. So the short answer on large, for those who don't know, large concept models are this idea that instead of, let's go back over here. Yeah, let's talk about some future-looking stuff. I also got a question about DeepSeek, which I think is a really interesting topic as well. But LCM, let's cover this really quickly. So LCM might be a future replacement for LLMs. The idea is LLMs operate on the token level, but a token is not like an idea. A token is very granular. It's expensive to output each token. If you have to output 1 million tokens to get an idea across, it can take a lot of tokens, a lot of time, a lot of compute, all this stuff. The LCM operates on the concept level. So a whole concept. The idea, part of the idea from what I understand is people don't really think in terms of words. They think in terms of concepts. Concepts can be represented in many things other than words, right? You might be a visual artist or whatever. And you're probably not thinking of things in a chain of words or tokens. You think of them kind of conceptually and they kind of come together conceptually. A concept can represent many tokens in one unit, which means in theory, the LCM could be smarter, faster, cheaper than today's LLMs, which would be freaking awesome. So that could be a good breakthrough. At the same time, we have, and they produced an awesome paper on this. Here's, for those of you who want to see the link, boom. Large concept models, language model in a sentence representation space. Really, 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 really cool. Yeah, I think the idea is instead of vectorizing words, vectorizing concepts. I don't know the details. I've only skimmed the paper and looking at some people's kind of like recaps and points of view on it. But that could be really cool. Another really cool one is DeepSeek. DeepSeek is supposed to be supposed to be roughly Claude 3.5 Sonnet. Good, but 30x cheaper or 30x more compute efficient. That's amazing because if you're doing programming, you want to be fast and good. That's awesome. That's something we keep seeing is that when you look at like charts of LLMs and which are good and where everyone else sits, you tend to find that there tends to be this like leveling off where at a certain point, all the models perform the same on the long tail because they all kind of catch up. So the more we can make the current quality bar faster, cheaper, better, that is huge and goes a long way too. And so DeepSeek, I think we're going to start experimenting at Builder internally on. I think could be a really, really interesting thing. There's also, what is it, QCQ? Hold on. And there's also a paper as well on basically how to represent, it's not QC, hold on, QCQ model. Hold on. Chinese O1 model competitor. QW? It's Q something. Reasoning. Hold on, let's find this. There's a model that replicates O1's performance and even beats O1's performance. I'm not talking about DeepSeek though. QWQ? QWQ, that must be it. Yes. Yes. QWQ preview. These are just all examples of you can, as soon as someone comes out with a model, other people can replicate it pretty quick. And there's a great paper that came out recently, I forget the name, of like how to build your own O1 model, the steps that you need, the way you need to train it, and how you can get comparable results. Super interesting stuff. We're definitely seeing that people can replicate results. We're definitely seeing models get smarter, and people can replicate the smart models and make them cheaper. And while I don't see reasoning models today being used for common use cases, I do think that's an interesting, it's a really, really interesting kind of area to explore. Okay, I need to wrap up here soon-ish, but let me check the chat. I missed a bunch of stuff. I was ranting earlier and missed if there's anything interesting going on in the chat. There usually is. Let's see. Some people kind of promoting their own stuff. I get it. I mean, I kind of am too. I'm talking about what I think is interesting, which is also includes like what we're working on and why. And people bring up Adobe Dreamweaver before. Dreamweaver was always horrible. Let's see. Anything else than having to manage your own site code on editors? I agree with that. Now I'm going way back in time. Okay, cool. I don't think I missed anything crazy. Oh yeah, and I do think. Let's see. A couple good things here too. So here's the other cool thing. Gemini is finally getting good. I was so disappointed in Google forever. Google invented LLMs. They wrote the paper. They introduced the world to the concept of transformers, and then they did nothing with it useful. They made this intellectual paper. They patted themselves on the back, and then OpenAI went, "Holy shit, this could be useful. We could commercialize this. Let's go make this a real product," and killed it. And Google like fumbled to like, and like, what's crazy, it's the type of product that could kill their core business, yet they didn't pursue it. And maybe that's because they were hoping nobody else would commercialize the thing, and they didn't want to have to deal with, search or anything like that. They didn't want to deal with the fact that LLMs could hurt the search business or would cause them to actually have to make fundamental changes to their search business. So maybe that's why they were cautious. But anyway, they were behind. Gemini was terrible AI for such a long time. I was so disappointed with Gemini for the longest freaking time. Only now, finally, has it gotten decently good and better. What is going on here? Sorry, why can't I write anymore? Okay, I've done something weird and my stuff doesn't work, but that's okay. Now Gemini is actually pretty good, and it's getting better. The reasoning is really good. The deep research is surprisingly good. Like, I'm so happy Google showed, like, hey, we can invent cool technology and we can actually use it for useful purposes. Thank freaking goodness. So good job, Google. They finally are showing that they can do AI and they can be useful. Okay, cool. It was a bug in Excalidraw. So thank goodness. And one other thing, actually, one other question I got that was pretty interesting is, so one comment is what I saw over the years is that developers are really closed-minded with using and integrating no-code tools into their products. Does Builder.io have this problem? Yes-ish. So it can be hit or miss. If a developer likes the idea of, I've got a website or app and I'm going to allow a marketing team to be able to make updates over an API. So a publish button, click the publish button and it can update this in I'll call it a less structured way. It's still a structure. You still have to use your components and this and that. That trust is hard for a developer because they know at the end of the day, if this breaks, people are not going to go to the marketing team. They're not going to know that this section is marketing controlled or whatever and go to them. They're going to go to the devs. The devs have to debug it. If they're not using their code and their tools, like what is this builder thing? How am I going to have to deal with that? It's really annoying. And so developers are very cautious about that. How we have solved that at Builder, that's really made a difference, is we said, hey, actually, don't start by, here's the finding. The finding is as soon as people integrate Builder, they're extremely happy with the workflow. The workflow of marketing can make updates and they don't have to get engineering tickets for them. That goes really well. And the fact that it turns out, marketing does a really good job with those updates. They are very thoughtful. They're on brand. They use the components correctly. Like all the things that developers worried the marketing team would do wrong, they don't. They do a really good job. They're surprisingly trustworthy with marketing content. Not surprising in hindsight, but there's always fears going forward because something like this hadn't existed before. They don't know what to think of it or what to make of it. And so they fear for the worst and say, hey, I don't know if I want to risk that. What's worked well for us is to say, hey, actually, the first use case, I made that diagram of all the things Builder can do with the JSON, and then you can take Figma and the AI and blah, 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 and the UI and read and write and export code or deploy over an API. We actually start people here these days. We say, actually, use Builder as a Figma to code product to start. Why? Because you're a front-end dev. Every day you're getting new Figma designs. Every day you have to turn them into code. We actually, I need to check in on if we've released this yet. We have this new CLI that's awesome. It uses the same tech that Cursor, Bolt, etc. use to actually, from Figma, I'll do a video on this at some point. From Figma, let's try and make a decent Figma logo this time. That's decent-ish. From Figma, you get, instead of like bouncing to Builder and seeing Builder's UI, so you just get a CLI command. The CLI command you run in your code, like from your terminal, from your VS Code, your Cursor, whatever. You just paste the CLI command in there. It scans your code base, it sees how you write code, and it figures out how to integrate the Figma design into your code. So it might recognize this is a homepage design, you have an index.tsx, it looks similar but different. It'll create a diff of the current code. It's really freaking cool. It works really, really, really well. So this is the use case. We say, hey, these sort of like bridge the gap tools between design tools and code can work really well for use cases you have every day, for things that you can just get immediate, like you can immediately see how it works. If you like that, then consider also integrating the API. You don't have to jump right to the API. The API is scary if you haven't really built trust in the platform. You haven't trusted like, hey, this thing works. Once you've used it for Figma to code use case, you realize the API can be really useful too. A lot of these Figma updates are to home pages, marketing sections. Let's actually say, hey, we'll still use Figma to code for code stuff, dashboards, etc. But for things that are purely marketing, let's just hook the API into that. So now we can go Figma to API, just publish those updates. Marketing, just do your thing, this section, this section, this section, just update however you want. And then we'll still go Figma to code for a bunch of other stuff. That like we know we want to have in code, which is still going to be the majority of things. This is going to be the majority of superficial stuff. New A/B test, new homepage, just promotion for one day, blah, blah, blah. You know, this can be a long tail, but the majority of heavy, important stuff is all going to go through the code just the same. That way, you don't have to just jump right into an API and this big decision or whatever. And so you can kind of dip your toes in and use that. That I think is pretty cool. And that's where I think a lot of this feature stuff is. I mean, there's other potential futures where Figma, like the other cool thing that we are putting time into right now that I think is really cool is this idea of code sync, where you've got your Figma design and you've got your code, and we might generate some code for you, but you update the code in various ways. You add functionality, you refactor it, etc. And then the design updates, now maybe we have 2 buttons here instead of 1, and then the CLI can just actually send a diff into your code for the bare minimum change to get that design update in. So maybe it subtracts this line, it adds that line, and that's it. So that's an interesting world where any designer or whatever could just be in Figma making updates, and the developer can accept those updates whenever they choose and don't have to figure out how to do all the changes involved. That's really cool, and that uses that CLI and kind of cursor-based, cursor-influenced workflow as well. We're using LLMs and vector search on your code, and in that world, it's pretty cool. Like, there's even future worlds where there is no Builder UI. You do all the AI, the test creation, all the UI stuff and AI stuff in Figma directly. And then in code, you can just kind of pull those changes in. The AI will update and create the diff and do those for you, but it respects the fact that you can keep editing your code. So design and code, always in sync. The workflow is clean. It is local. It's not PR based. It's local. So you can just hit the sync button anytime, review the changes, modify. And yes, we very much might make a VS Code extension. Everybody's making a VS Code extension. We will not make a VS Code fork. I'll tell you that. We might make it a VS Code extension for this too. That I think would be pretty cool. Right now, it's a CLI based flow, which I think works great, but we can make it a little bit more visual with the VS Code extension, which would be cool too. And we make sure it's compatible with Cursor, Windsurf, and the forks as well. Here's a funny question from Val. Val, is there any ChatGPT-like UI out there that lets me plug in my API keys for OpenAI, Claude, etc., and switch between models easily? There are a couple. There is a couple open source chat products where you can plug in your own keys. One is, I mean, you could also just use the Vercel AI playground. That works pretty well. Zed. I don't like the Zed editor personally. It's good if you like Vim mode. The AI features are really disappointing though. But you did remind me of one other thing. So Cursor also and Cursor Chat, you can download Cursor and use Cursor's chat and plug in your own API keys too. So that's one way you can just have a ChatGPT like UI ish. With your own keys, etc., which is pretty cool. Anyway, I need to wrap up this stream because I need to go eat. But thank you all for joining. I thought this was really fun. I hope the ranting and rambling on different topics was interesting. Always hit me with your questions and comments. I definitely don't want to create a VS Code fork. That's a lot of comments on builders to create a VS Code fork. I don't want to create a VS Code fork, at least not today. Open Web UI. Maybe that's a good one. Anyway, thank you all for joining. Thank you for all the great comments and feedback. I'm trying to live stream more often, do this more. Let me know if there are topics that would be interesting to stream about. I'm going to turn some of these things into videos. I still am going to create a video on Klein because I think Klein is pretty cool. And anyway, otherwise, I'll catch you all next